France has just delivered the toughest sanctions blow Russia has faced since the start of the war. A move so severe that even Moscow didn't see it coming. Billions frozen, trade routes shut, and a new ultimatum straight from Paris to the Kremlin. But here's the twist. Behind this bold action is a ticking ceasefire countdown. And if Putin doesn't respond in time, the consequences could reshape the entire war. Stay with me, because what France just unleashed changes everything. Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today's update is one of the most significant turning points in the Russia-Ukraine war so far. France has just imposed its toughest, most aggressive sanctions package against Russia, shocking even European allies with the speed and intensity of the decision. Paris is no longer playing the diplomatic waiting game. President Emmanuel Macron has made it clear time is running out for Moscow, and the ceasefire clock has officially begun ticking. These new sanctions aren't symbolic. They target Russia's financial arteries, overseas assets, energy networks, and even the shadow fleet that has been secretly moving Russian oil across global waters. France isn't just tightening the screws. It's aiming straight at the heart of Russia's war economy. But the real turning point is the warning attached. If Russia does not agree to a ceasefire within the outlined timeframe, France will push the EU and NATO for even harsher collective action, potentially triggering the biggest geopolitical showdown since the start of the invasion. Throughout this video, we'll break down what sanctions France imposed, why this moment is different, how the Kremlin is reacting, and what this countdown could mean for Ukraine's battlefield reality. So stay locked in, because what you're about to hear has shifted the entire global conversation overnight. France's new sanctions package is being described by analysts as a financial strike wave, targeting the Russian economy on multiple levels. The centerpiece is the mass freezing of Russian state-linked assets, including bank accounts, corporate holdings, and properties connected to oligarchs and Kremlin-backed companies. According to early data, over 2.7 billion worth of Russian-linked assets have already been seized or blocked from operation in France alone. But it goes deeper. For the first time, France is moving to criminalize the facilitation of Russia's shadow fleet, the secretive tanker network that has allowed Moscow to bypass oil restrictions. Any French or EU-based business caught aiding these ships, whether through insurance, maintenance, or port access, will face severe penalties. Paris has also cut back on the remaining LNG ties that Russia still relies on for European income. While this may not be a full ban yet, it's a dramatic escalation signaling that France is willing to take on energy risks to weaken Moscow's war machine. What alarms Russia most is the coordinated nature of this action. France has already pushed the EU to follow its lead, meaning a continent-wide shutdown of Russian financial pathways could soon become reality. These measures don't just hit Russia's economy. They strike at morale, logistics, and the Kremlin's ability to sustain long-term war expenditures. And with the ceasefire clock ticking, France is sending one message: negotiate or pay a much higher price. The phrase, ceasefire clock, has now entered global headlines because France has attached a political deadline to its sanctions, a move rarely seen in modern diplomacy. Macron's message to Moscow was blunt: stop the attacks, agree to talks, or face a new phase of economic isolation. Sources inside the French Foreign Ministry reveal that this ultimatum wasn't made overnight. Paris has been quietly coordinating with Washington, Berlin, and key NATO partners for weeks. But the catalyst was Russia's recent escalation: missile strikes across Ukrainian cities, new operations in the east, and the increasing use of Iranian drones. France believes that without direct pressure tied to a timeline, Russia will continue dragging out negotiations indefinitely. So Paris chose a new strategy: force movement through economic urgency. The clock isn't just symbolic. If Russia fails to show tangible progress toward a ceasefire within the stated timeframe, France plans to propose a full EU ban on Russian LNG, sanctions targeting Russia's nuclear energy sector, expanded restrictions on Russian banks still operating through loopholes, so severe penalties for companies aiding Russia's shadow fleet, additional freezes on oligarch assets of Europe. This is why Kremlin officials are calling the move economic warfare. France is betting that compressing Russia's financial oxygen will pressure Putin into negotiation. The world is now watching Moscow's next move. As expected, the Kremlin's response was fierce and immediate. Russia accused France of abandoning diplomacy and warned that these actions would bring consequences for European stability. But behind the strong words, there are signs of real concern inside Moscow. Russian financial analysts are already calling France's asset freeze devastating. Several oligarchs with major holdings in Paris, Nice, and Monaco have gone silent, fearing further seizures. Russian state media rushed to downplay the sanctions, but internal leaks say the government was caught off guard by the scale. Moscow also fears that France's decisive actions will inspire Germany, Italy, Spain, and Poland to join a harsher EU-wide package. If that happens, Russia could lose tens of billions in European revenue streams within months. Interestingly, Russia's foreign ministry summoned the French ambassador for urgent discussions, a sign the Kremlin is worried about escalation. The shadow fleet crackdown is especially damaging without France's cooperation. Russia's secretive oil transport routes become significantly harder to operate. Despite the tough rhetoric, Russia's economic ministries are scrambling to assess the long-term impact. Internal memos reportedly warn that continued sanctions could destabilize the ruble, weaken export income, and strain war funding. France's goal is clear: make the cost of continuing the war heavier than the cost of negotiating. Russia now faces a strategic dilemma: ignore the ultimatum and risk deeper isolation, or move toward a ceasefire it has avoided for nearly 3 years. France's strategic timing wasn't accidental. Ukraine is entering a critical phase of the war, with winter conditions tightening and supply chains facing stress. Paris believes that applying economic pressure on Russia now, when logistics are toughest, creates maximum impact. Ukraine has welcomed France's sanctions publicly and privately. Officials in Kiev say that targeting Russia's shadow fleet is one of the strongest moves any EU nation has taken this year. The shadow fleet has been a lifeline for Moscow, allowing it to covertly move discounted oil to Asia. Disrupting this network cuts directly into Russia's war funding. Additionally, France's asset freeze affects key Russian companies involved in producing machinery, parts, and components used in the war. Ukrainian analysts argue that this could slow down Russia's ability to replenish military equipment. President Zelensky personally thanked Macron, calling the sanctions a major step toward peace through pressure. Kiev believes that the ceasefire clock gives diplomatic momentum at a time when battlefield gains are limited. Ukraine is also hopeful that this move marks a shift in Europe's attitude, from slow sanctions to aggressive, targeted economic strikes. But while Ukraine celebrates, it also remains cautious. Russia has a history of resisting diplomatic pressure. That's why Kiev is urging the EU to stand behind France fully, because unity makes the pressure exponentially stronger. France's message is simple: this is the moment to push hardest. One of the biggest shifts happening right now is the strong alignment between France and the United States on Russia's economic isolation. For months, analysts believed Paris was taking a softer, more diplomatic approach compared to Washington. But these new sanctions show a complete recalibration. U.S. officials privately praised France's move, calling it a necessary escalation. The U.S. Treasury Department is now coordinating with French financial authorities to track Russian assets and identify companies supporting the shadow fleet. This joint effort could lead to multinational takedowns of oil tankers operating through loopholes. Additionally, France's decision strengthens NATO's position. For months, NATO members debated how far to go without triggering further escalation. France stepping forward boldly shifts the balance. It signals that major European powers are ready to act decisively, not just issue statements. Behind closed doors, there are discussions about a wider sanctions coalition, potentially involving Canada, Japan, South Korea, and Australia. The goal would be to form a unified economic front that Russia cannot bypass. French intelligence services are also sharing data with allies on Russian covert networks in Europe, suspected shell companies, hidden bank accounts, and logistics hubs supplying the war. This suggests a larger coordinated crackdown could be coming. The West's message is aligning increased pressure, shorten Russia's timeline, and force political movement. The ceasefire clock is no longer just Paris's strategy. It's becoming a Western strategy. To understand the full impact of France's actions, you need to look at the economic shockwaves already hitting Russia. The ruble has been showing signs of instability, and analysts expect more pressure in the coming days as markets digest the news. Russian banks operating in Europe are entering emergency mode, attempting to shift assets before further freezes occur. Several high-profile oligarchs reportedly contacted Kremlin officials asking for immediate diplomatic action to protect their wealth. When oligarch pressure rises, it often signals that major internal fractures are forming. Russia's state budget is already stretched, and the winter season increases costs for energy subsidies, military operations, and humanitarian support in occupied territories. France's sanctions strike at a moment when financial strain is highest. Meanwhile, Russia's shadow fleet crackdown has the potential to reduce oil revenue significantly. If tankers become too risky or too expensive to operate, Russia may lose one of its most profitable loopholes. Industrial sectors are also feeling the squeeze. The sanctions target dual-use technologies, items that can be used for both civilian and military purposes. This slows down Russia's ability to build drones, armored vehicles, and missile components. All of this compounds into a clear message: Russia cannot afford long-term economic warfare with a united Europe. And that is exactly what France wants Russia to realize before the ceasefire clock runs out. While France is applying pressure, it is also preparing for Russia's potential counter-actions. Moscow may respond with cyber attacks, information warfare, energy manipulation, or diplomatic retaliation. Paris knows this, and that's why it has entered a phase of defensive readiness. French cybersecurity agencies have already raised alerts for government institutions, banks, and energy companies. There are fears that Russia could target critical infrastructure through cyber operations. France learned from past Russian cyber incidents across Europe, and this time they're prepared. Energy security is another concern. Russia no longer supplies gas directly to most of Europe, but Moscow still has influence in global markets. France has increased LNG reserves and strengthened energy ties with Norway, Algeria, and the United States to weather the winter. Diplomatically, Russia may attempt to divide the EU by pressuring more cautious countries like Hungary or Slovakia. But France is already engaging with them, emphasizing that strong collective action now prevents bigger conflicts later. Paris is also increasing naval monitoring to track shadow fleet movements in European waters. This means Russia can no longer operate freely. In short, France is not only hitting hard, it's bracing for impact. And that level of preparation tells you just how serious this geopolitical moment is. France isn't backing down. The question is, will Russia? Let's talk about what comes next, because the consequences of this showdown could reshape the war. If Russia responds to the ceasefire clock by opening serious negotiations, this could be the first real path toward de-escalation in over 2 years. France hopes that economic pressure, not military escalation, will force Moscow back to the table. But if Russia refuses, Europe is preparing an unprecedented response. A full-scale EU energy ban, expanded financial restrictions, and coordinated NATO action would put Russia under economic isolation similar to Iran or North Korea. For Ukraine, a ceasefire, even temporary, could allow for humanitarian relief, rebuilding and strengthening defensive lines. Kyiv hopes France's bold move becomes a turning point. However, analysts warn that a cornered Russia could also escalate militarily. That's why NATO is staying alert and increasing intelligence monitoring. What makes France's move so significant is that it changes the narrative. For months, Europe was perceived as slow, moving, cautious, and divided. But this decision signals a shift. Europe is taking charge. France is stepping into a leadership role. And Russia is being confronted with hard deadlines rather than open-ended diplomacy. This next phase of the war will be defined by economic pressure, political timing, and strategic calculations. The world is watching Moscow's next move closely. As we reach the end of this report, one thing is crystal clear. France has changed the game. These sanctions aren't just another economic measure. They're a strategic weapon designed to force a decisive moment in the war. By attaching a ceasefire countdown, France is telling Russia that the era of slow diplomacy is over. Paris wants movement, real movement, toward peace talks. And this approach may be the first real pressure campaign capable of shifting the conflict in a meaningful way. The Kremlin is rattled, Ukraine is energized, NATO is aligned, and the European Union is preparing for the possibility that this ultimatum could define its long-term relationship with Moscow. The next days and weeks will reveal everything. Will Russia negotiate to relieve pressure? Or will it resist and face the hardest economic winter in modern history? One thing is certain: the world has entered a new phase, and France just stepped into the center of it. If you found this report informative, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more fast, accurate, and detailed updates. Your support helps us bring the truth forward faster. Stay tuned, stay informed, and we'll see you in the next update.